I was listening to your podcast, your episode from last week, and I think you touched on some really good things. Like you talked about how we veterans tend to ball up into like a armadillo. You were talking about the armadillo, and we ball up and have a shell on us. And we don't want to talk about our problems, and I think that's why our first guest here today is why we have her here. I think you touched the nail on that, though.
Yeah.
Do you want to introduce yourself to us?
Yeah, tell us a little bit about
So I'm
yourself.
Nikole Johnson. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, so independently licensed clinical social worker in North Carolina and Connecticut, and I'm working on Texas. And my specialty is PTSD, trauma, particularly in first responders and military. So I've worked on Fort Bragg, or now Fort Liberty, with the Special Forces units, with active duty, and seeing people just in private practice. I also worked with Wounded Warrior Project for a while, running Project Odysseys. If you've never heard of it, they're amazing. They're like week-long mental health retreats geared towards veterans. They also have couples retreats, and I think they were starting family retreats working there. So definitely something to look into. Because
that's pretty
it's not
cool. I haven't heard
therapy,
of that.
so you're not sitting around like, everybody has this idea of like this like kumbaya kind of like, let's all get in a circle and cry. But it's definitely not like that. So even though I don't work for them anymore, I really do advocate for their program.
What do they do for that month that you're there?
Let's just do the elephant in the room, right? Veteran suicides are at an all-time, and mental health's always an issue. It's a serious issue that's in our community. What's the biggest thing you see from the veterans that you've helped? Like, what do you think the biggest issue is, in your opinion?
Honestly, so I think there's a big misconception about things like PTSD and depression like automatically equaling suicide, although it can certainly increase the risk of suicide. That's not entirely true. I do think that the suicides that kind of happen as a result of PTSD or depression or concurrent with that, a lot of times it's because of just like lack of connection, like you were talking about, right? Like that armadillo kind of ball up, shut everybody out because, like, God forbid you contaminate other people with the stuff that you deal with. You just want to protect everybody around you and kind of retreat into yourself. We are not solitary animals. We are herd creatures. We need connection and we need people. And when we start isolating ourselves like that, it can become a very dark, deep hole. And then a lot of times I feel like, particularly with people like first responders and military, it just gets to a point where you can kind of convince ourselves that the world would be better without us and without the demons that we carry. And I think there's a big gap in care. Some people in the military, especially, like, we talk about like big army changing some policies and doing this and that and the other thing in the public eye. But then when you're actually there, a lot of times that doesn't really trickle down, and the culture hasn't really changed yet to be one of supporting each other through mental health journeys. And I think that that's really where the failure starts, unfortunately.
I kind of agree with you. Just from my perspective on one time coming back, they kind of just rubber stamp it. I think they should put every single person coming back from deployment to a therapist, and the therapist has to clear them. Instead, they give you like a questionnaire. And of course, when you come back, you're going to be like, "Are you good? Oh yeah, I'm great." You're probably just rubber stamping it just back, and they're like, "Oh, he filled out the questionnaire. He's good." And that's the thing is, I mean, Jones, you've been on a couple deployments. You know what I'm talking about. They just ask you like a questionnaire if you're good when you come back. And of course, you don't want to act like you're a wuss or anything. That's the whole thing. You're like, I'm fine. But we aren't fine. Most of us aren't.
How long have you been a therapist for?
7 years.
Okay. So for quite some time. What made you decide to go that route?
I didn't want to. So I started my first master's degree is in animal behavior and conservation. I can't even talk today. And I really wanted to do research on marine mammals and like their like social structure in the field. So I just want to be like on a boat in the ocean all day long, essentially. And then the year that I graduated from that program was the year that the economy like tanked. It was like 2008 ish. And the first place that money came out of was conservation efforts because it's like, who needs to help the animals when we're barely living as humans? So that really sucked. And I was like, well, I got to do something. And I was like, well, for job security, I guess everybody comes to me for advice anyway. I might as well just get paid to do it. And I can do it until I lose my mental faculties, right? Like, it's not like, oh, I'm going to be 70 years old, my walker on the boat in the middle of the ocean.
No, and that's a good skill to have because there's always going to be people with problems. That's for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. And then from there, I started like narrowing it down to like, okay, like I really want to work with military and trauma and PTSD, first responders, and it made me feel a little bit better about becoming a therapist.
So out of those two, are they pretty similar working with first responders and veterans, or are they different in a lot of ways?
Yes, both. So the majority of our like police force and fire department too, I believe, it are veterans. So there kind of overlaps, right? And then, but the difference, one of the primary differences, I think, is in just the day-to-day experiences. So if you're a police officer, every day, any call can really be your last. You don't ever really know what you're walking into when you're walking into anything. Um, and when you're in the military, generally speaking, you're pretty safe on base in, at least in America, right? Or
Yeah.
most places overseas also. And you're only really in danger when you're on a deployment somewhere. So like my brother was deployed to some mountains in like northern Afghanistan, and he was field artillery, so they were taking mortars and sending mortars, but taking them mostly, especially when there was like a change of, shift essentially. And so it's like that every day. Like, am I going to be walking to the mess hall and the mess hall is not going to be there because it got blown up? I don't know. So there's definitely like when you're on a deployment, I think that pressure, that psychological pressure is greater. But first responders, it's kind of stretched out over the course of their career. And especially depending on which way the
Right.
political winds are blowing, like you can just be like a Boy Scout in a police uniform, and just because of the uniform, the clothes that you wear, you're going to be a target for somebody. Whereas I feel like generally speaking, society seems to have a little bit more respect for military.
Yeah, I could see that. I've
Loosely speaking.
I've always been curious too about like when I was deployed, getting shot at by like someone else that I know I'm at war at or war with made sense to me. I never liked the idea of coming home and getting shot at by people who are Americans as well. We all live together. We're supposed to be helping each other, and that's when I got out. That's the main reason I didn't go the police officer route. Was if I'm at war with another country or different ideologies, it kind of makes sense. But you come back and you can get shot at home or anywhere you go. I never really liked that. So I could see it affecting them a lot worse.
Yeah. And I think that's another key difference too. Oh, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I was going to say it's mind blowing to think of too that you're going around your community and you have that possibility and that risk. But I also think it also depends on like where you're at too. I feel like if you're a rural county sheriff, you probably don't. I mean, that possibility is probably in the back of your mind, but it's not the same as like maybe if you're an urban cop in Chicago, right? Or you work in a big city. So it's kind of like the same thing I think in the military. I mean, it depends on what you do and and where you're at, just like you said. So if you're a combat arms, the chances are you're probably going to go somewhere that's not very friendly. And if you're a cook, you still have a possibility. But it's I think it's crazy though, because when you go on that deployment though, everyone has to face some type of crazy, whether it be mortars coming in or something going on. and it all kind of affects each person differently. And like for you as a therapist, when you coming back, what are the common like, what do you really like, you talked about earlier, like depression. Do you think a lot of guys coming back out are coming back from deployment are depressed, and is that what you're seeing, or what do you think?
I think it really depends. If they're coming back injured, I think that typically comes very much hand in hand with depression. If they're coming back with TBIs, we can see a lot of personality change. You can see a lot more depression or anxiety, things like that. Plus, usually, if you have a TBI, it's because something blew up near you. And that can come along with PTSD and trauma, although not always, right? Um, I think what is very much the same between the military and with first responders is that perceived administrative betrayal um, really can lend itself to developing things like depression or PTSD or exasperating PTSD symptoms. So, you come back, you're having some difficulties, maybe not right away. Maybe on that questionnaire, you're answering it truthfully and everything seems like it's okay because you're not really redeployed. You're not assimilated back to
Right.
quite yet. You're not having those conversations with grandma who's like, "Oh, you murdered people." So you're not really kind of having those yet. Um, but then later on, when something comes up, a lot of times it can be dismissed. Like, "Oh, why are you having this experience now and not 6 months ago?" Well, because that's how it works, right? But a lot of people don't
Yeah.
understand. Um,
You see a
so
lot of veterans get denied VA benefits due to that too, where they'll
yeah,
come in and right off a deployment, you're still amped up. You're like, oh no, I'm fine. We had a blast. And then 6 months down the line, when you come back, they're like, oh, you said you were okay for on everything. Looks like you're just trying to pull some benefits out of us.
right, which is ridiculous because diagnostic criteria for PTSD is not until more than 30 days after the event happened. If you're having issues within 30 days of when the event happened, that's adjustment disorder. Nothing to do with PTSD. It's only once it
Yeah.
goes beyond that 30 days and there's a like a latency period also that I don't think is really really well outlined in the DSM. So that can kind of also, like, if you're dealing with people at the VA who don't really understand how to, like, the nuances of certain diagnoses, you can certainly kind of just shove it away and stuff it down and live out this whole career. And then after you retire and you can finally decompress and breathe a little bit, now all of a sudden you have PTSD, but it was
Yeah.
kind of held at
And a
bay
lot
the
of
whole
guys are, I was going to say, a lot of guys are scared too once you, because they don't know the process or the treatments that if they go and immediately say, hey, I have PTSD or something's not right, that they may get kicked out and they're wanting a whole career, or they'll be thrown on medication, or maybe they'll take their rifle away. Or I mean, I've heard all kinds of. I had these fears. I was terrified they'd put me on some sort of watch list or make it to where I couldn't buy guns. There's a lot of misconceptions with PTSD that keeps people scared to tell the truth.
yeah.
It's it's I'm gonna share a little story with that too. As I got out, right, I went to college and I rented a house, and the agreement, it was actually kind of a crazy agreement. He's like, hey, my son's going to live in the basement, so I need some cool college kids that want to rent, be roommates with my son. And I was like, yeah, this seems like a good deal, right? But he straight up, he's like, oh, you're a veteran. He's like, I just got to ask, like, since you're going to live with my son, like, do you have like PTSD or on some kind of list or anything like that? And I was like, wait, what? Like, there is a stigma to it, and I think, probably in every, probably any veteran that's gone on deployment probably has a different type of PTSD, and I think there's probably like a different, way that each person reacts to it. Some people maybe have anger issues, some people maybe have depression, some people are probably just fine, but it's a stigma that people think that it's crazy that someone would say that and think that a person just he's going to be violent just chilling. I don't know what
Yeah.
in your opinion, do you get a lot of feedback from people that are like they're violent or anything like that? Let's cancel this stigma right now.
Honestly, I feel like
Or
I
enforce it.
don't hear that a lot because I would absolutely put people in their place about that, and I have. I think part of the culprit is media. Something happens and it just, whatever. I can't think of like specific examples right now, but it's always like the headline: "Veteran with PTSD shoots this," or whatever.
Yeah.
So I think that doesn't help because you have people, just regular citizens who, I mean, the average education level in the US isn't really as high as kind of we would like it to be. So you kind of take a little bit of that information and make very big generalizations, right? Critical thinking doesn't seem to be America's strong point, unfortunately. And that definitely adds to it. When my brother got out of, he was an officer. So when he got out, he was going through, I forgot what program it was, but it was really to like help the officers get into the workforce and all that when they got out. And he went on interviews and people with companies that agreed to engage in this program where they were taking veterans because he had field artillery experience. They were like, we don't really know what to do with you because like your experience is basically like just combat. And they were made like, I don't, like some offhand comment where they were kind of afraid that he might like do something. It's like, well, first of all, field artillery is big guns. He's not going to just bring one to work one day and do something, right? So like, don't be stupid.
He might start shelling us.
Right. I'm like, come on. But I think that doesn't help, right? And then within the military community or within the first responder community, there are still a lot of misconceptions where it's just hard.
I was going to say, too, it probably doesn't, it probably doesn't help, too, that a lot of, especially infantry bases, are very violent. And it may not even be PTSD related. It's just you got a bunch of 18-year-old dudes with lots of testosterone. They either are about to deploy or just got back from deployment. Well, I mean, most of them are drinking, so they're going out, they're getting in bar fights, they're beating each other up, fighting the MPs, and people might just say, oh, I guess they all got PTSD, or there's got to be a reason they're this violent. But it's just, most of it's just a bunch of young, hyped up dudes going out, getting drunk, and
just being stupid because
just getting in fights that has nothing to do with deployments.
Right. It's like you have all these people who are like 18, your brain doesn't even finish developing until about 25, and now we're putting them in these situations where it's like aggression. You have to be aggressive, right? Like you have to be trained to be violent in situations when it's appropriate. The problem is that without a prefrontal cortex that's fully developed, you don't really know when it's appropriate and when it's not. Now, when you're 18 to 25, you can kind of override it by like being a little bit more like intellectual, but our brains kind of still aren't equipped to handle that.
I'd be curious your thoughts. Do you think that maybe they should make the age requirement to join the military a little later then?
Yes. And I wish that they did the same psychological testing that you need to go through in order to become a first responder. I applied to police departments.
I can agree with both those statements.
A whole battery of like the MMPI, the personality test, all of these different things. If you've ever said that you went to therapy before, like you had to like go and see a therapist, and that also went for MEPS as well. But when you were going through MEPS, if you ever had said yes that you went to a therapist, you met with somebody for like 15 minutes and they said yes or no. And that was the extent of the psychological evaluation. So if I never went to therapy, but I had a personality disorder, that 15 minutes with that psychiatrist they wouldn't have known. And then now I'm in there, now I'm a liability because then you add stress on top of some of these pre-existing conditions. And of course you're going to get something. Maybe not necessarily PTSD, but you're going to get something else, right?
I think that's kind of what they're wanting is, young 18-year-old dudes that'll just do what they're told, go gung-ho for anything. I mean, that's
Yeah.
what changed my perspective on it. Was when I was 18, that's the first thing I wanted to do was enlist, go deploy, fight for my country, be violent. I mean, that's what I wanted out of the military, was just to be that guy I saw on TV. And then after 6 years, I was like, man, I don't know if I was should have been handed a gun and sent overseas immediately.
Yeah.
I mean, I agree with it. Like, I think one thing too to think about is we have this number attached to, oh, now you're 18, you're an adult, and I'm like, and that here I'm in 33, right? And I've hung out with a buddy, right? And he's like, all right, here's my little brother, he's 18, and I'm like, this guy's a kid. This is still a kid. Like those, like you said, the brain is not developed, especially for the male, right? Till 25. Why do we have these weird, like, we got these weird numbers attached to when someone's an adult or when they can do certain things? Like, right? Oh, you're an adult, but you can't drink till you're 21, but you can buy cigarettes or you can go fight in the military. Like, it's weird. Like,
Right.
who decided that? Like, it doesn't
It
even
does
make
seem
sense. And then you
very
see kind of
arbitrary.
like some of these. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just agreeing that it is very arbitrary.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And that's probably what happens. Like, we get some of these problems because you get these young kids. They're still kids. They go and fight in a war, and then of course they come back. And how do they process that? Because like I said, let's be honest. The military just rubber stamps everything. They're like, here's the questionnaire, and let me tell you, there's a thing in the military. You don't report you have problems in the military. Like Jones said, he was scared if he said anything, he didn't want to get like on a list or blah blah blah. That's how it is. Nobody wants to say they have a problem because they don't want to take that type of
Or mocked.
Mocked. Yeah, you get mocked.
Yeah, because
it's.
I mean, I'll be honest. I was that guy for a while. I mean, a couple years in, if I had, say, a private who had never deployed, and he clearly had mental issues before, and tried to say, he had PTSD from, I don't know, boot camp or training or being smoked in the field, I'm gonna harass this guy. I'm gonna give him a hard time because I've deployed, I've shot at people I've been shot at, and this guy's crying about his little 2 minutes in the field, and it breeds that. I mean, it gets worse and worse as you're in. I mean, it makes it really hard for guys to come out and say, "Oh yeah, I'm having mental problems," because they know they're gonna get the shit into the stick.
So it's hard because PTSD is about perception and not necessarily about the facts of what happened, right? So if you perceive that your life is in danger or that there is danger to life around you or you witness somebody get injured, those are all part of the diagnostic criteria. So it doesn't even have to necessarily be I went to war and was getting shot at or taking mortars. It could be, hey, I was in an airborne unit and my parachute got tangled, and yeah, I got myself out of it and I landed maybe a little bit hard, but I landed and I'm okay. But in that moment, I thought I was going to die. And maybe the people on the ground who were watching also thought you were going to die. And so all of those people could then develop some aspect of PTSD. And it is a spectrum, right? Like people have kind of different symptoms and different degrees of different symptoms. But if you're meeting the criteria, you kind of have like the same similar symptoms. So, I mean, all of those people could have at least the groundwork laid for then developing PTSD later on. So for people who were like, oh, I had PTSD from boot camp, they could either be using that term very loosely and not know really what they're talking about.
Yeah.
Right. But then also if they've never in their life been challenged in that way, they can really potentially believe that like this, I might not make it through this.
Yeah, they're 18 and they got 10 psychopaths in their face screaming at them and maybe hitting them in the back of the helmet while they're trying to shoot a gun. I mean, they do say some crazy stuff too, like they're gonna fuck your brains out or whatever. I mean, they say all kinds of like insane things where this kid who's probably never heard it before is like, oh man, they might actually kill me if I mess up.
Yeah.
I remember we had a platoon sergeant, and every other word out of his mouth was the F bomb. Like it's just, it's just scary. Like, but it is crazy because when you think about it, some of these are kids, right? These are kids, and they come in there and they get thrown into this mess. But then at the same time, it's crazy when you think about the outside. We were talking about how people perceive veterans, and there is a definitely, you said there's a good perception of veterans. Americans love veterans. However, I I'm gonna push back a little bit. This might be a little controversial, but it feels like they don't want to touch them. They're like, oh, we love veterans, but when it comes to veteran problems, they don't want to touch it. They don't want to talk about it and admit that, and they're like, oh,
Or they don't know
I'm a,
how.
yeah.
Right.
And I think that's the one thing that that hit me is we get disconnected. I think the veteran community, we come out and we go out into the life, and we're functioning. However, not everyone understands us, or they don't want to understand us. And at the same time, my buddy that I served with, he understands me, but I don't get to talk to him anymore. And I think that's one of the big reasons why I was so excited to start this podcast, is because I feel like we can connect people again, and we can have these conversations again. Because let's be honest, I can't have these conversations with the average person. They don't understand it, and I think this is an incredible opportunity for that, because maybe people can understand a little bit more that, you know, that understanding towards veterans. I just don't understand like why they don't want to. People don't want to touch it. You know, it's just it's a touchy subject, but it's obviously an issue because we're dealing with all the problems that come with it. You know, there's a lot, and so as you as a therapist, though, I'm just curious, like, what are the like what are the common resources or resources that you give to veterans that are having these issues? Like, how do you connect them to the community?
That's a really good question. Um, Honestly, I think I think it depends on what they're specifically like dealing with. Um, Sometimes it'll just be like, hey, you've been married for 15 years. Maybe start talking to your wife about some of this stuff. Not to dump on her, not to make it like, oh, she's my therapist now. But when you're having a really bad moment, and whether that's you have PTSD or not, like if we can all have bad days, especially when we've had combat experiences, um, we're just really challenging aspects in our life where we've lost somebody. Our bodies remember, and that's why we tend to be a little bit more asholic around anniversary times, right? Like even if we don't realize what date it is, our bodies know. And so maybe that's a good opportunity to start like, hey, like open up to your wife. Like if you have kids who realize that, like, hey, like what's wrong with daddy? And I'm saying, assuming male for veteran, whatever, just because it's predominantly male.
Yeah.
Um, there are great resources for like having an age appropriate conversation about like what is wrong. What how do you have a conversation with a 6-year-old about PTSD? You certainly don't open up the DSM-5 and start going through diagnostic criteria, right? But there are ways to
Right.
have those conversations. And I think that that is the most important thing in starting to be able to expand those connections. Because if you're not really feeling connected at home, you're going to feel even more disconnected at home when you're starting to connect again with, oh, the only person who understands me is my battle buddy. Well, maybe your wife wasn't there with you, but she's the person that you spend the most time with. So you need to be you need to feel like you're understood to a degree, right?
Right. Which is a hard thing to do too, because I think it was probably 8 years into my marriage before I started talking about anything. And most of it was two sides. Half of it was I didn't want it to sound like it wasn't as hardcore as like TV makes it out to be. Like maybe I would tell her the story that I thought was traumatic, and she'd be like, "Oh, well, that doesn't sound so bad." And I don't know, that kind of took a shot at my pride. I had made up these scenarios where it wouldn't be enough. And then on the other side, where she'd hear it and be like, wow, this dude's a psychopath. And that always scared me too. So I just due to both of those, I was like, man, I'll just keep it to myself and we'll just keep trucking along. And it wasn't until we were having issues that I was like, well, maybe this is my chance to open up and hopefully it'll make a little more sense.
Yeah.
So would you say, just to any veteran right now listening now, it's probably a good idea, just start talking those, maybe try to get a little more open, communicate with your spouse, right? That's what you're saying. Start that conversation maybe a little early. It's better to not let it get bottled in. I'm just curious too. I want to, because you were talking a little bit, that sounds a little bit more like a male with his spouse. What's your experience with female military, female soldiers, do you see different problems with female veterans?
Yeah. Obviously military sexual trauma is a big thing, right? I think it's severely underreported in the male population just because of shame, right? Nobody wants to seem gay or, whatever. I feel like women at this point are a little bit more vocal about things like that when they can be. I had some females when I was working on Fort Bragg tell me that basically if you're a female, you have 3 options. You're either a lesbian, you're a whore, or you're a bitch. And those are your choices. You can't just be a good female soldier. And so that puts, I think, a different level of stress when every day they're trying to just be equal, but then also not be noticed. Like, you don't want to be passed over for your promotion. You want to be noticed and recognized for your good work. But then when you do get promoted, people talk about like, oh, the reason why you got promoted was because you were having sex with somebody. So
Yeah, I could
there's
see that.
a huge issue when it comes to that type of stuff. I think that their PTSD or depression, anxiety, like any like mental health symptoms show up a little bit differently in females than males anyway. I feel like males kind of tend to default a little bit more to the isolation or aggression, where females
And would you
might.
say theirs is more? Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. No.
I was just going to say, would you say that theirs is predominantly sexual, whereas men's are usually war or violence related?
Um, it's hard to say just because we have such a small percentage of females who are actually involved in
Yeah.
direct combat. That's a fairly new thing, relatively speaking, right? So I think that they have
Yeah.
kind of more opportunity for the sexual trauma to happen than the combat trauma. But we do have females who go into combat zones and absolutely have PTSD due to combat, or they are involved in or witness an accident at trainings. I've had a lot of people come to me with like, hey, we did this training and a vehicle rolled over and like these 2 guys died, and it was basically like, okay, now the officers come in, they're like, we'll take care of it, and kind of just send you on your way and never talk about it again, right? So females that are involved in these types of like more dangerous trainings, I guess, can also be exposed to the same things. But I feel like the focus, and this bothers me to a degree, because I feel like the focus is primarily on females with military sexual traumatic experiences versus they can also have combat or training related experiences where there's been a loss of life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do female soldiers, airmen, sailors, do they have similar like symptoms or problems that a male has? Like, do they, or is there a difference? How do they cope with it? Is it similar or different, or yeah?
I feel like, again, generally speaking, right, because every person is different, but I feel like women are far more likely to be verbal about it. So we're going to have somebody somewhere that we're talking to about like, hey, this is something that happened, or be more open or amenable to the idea of, okay, maybe I don't want to talk to my friends because my friends right now are just my coworkers, and that gets complicated, right? When you're active duty, especially. So I think they might be more amenable to talking to a therapist or talking to somebody outside of that military realm, where I feel like men tend to armadillo themselves.
Armadillo.
Right? I can handle it. This is bullshit. Like, I could just like drink my way past, be fine. Kind of having a little bit more of that, like, I'm going to be like tougher on myself kind of attitude, just because gender differences, right?
Yeah.
We see this in little kids. Girls are far more verbal. And if you watch a little boy, he's making sound effects and jumping off of things, right? He's falling on the floor, getting up covered in bruises, and he's like, "Oh, I'm good,"
I still do that.
Verbal.
The sound effects.
So those types of things kind of carry through into how we end up dealing with things, hard things that happen in our lives. And I think part of that is also just generationally the way that we raise our boys and our girls to be our boys are a little bit less expressive about emotions, right? You're allowed to be angry. You're allowed to be happy. You can't be joyful though, because that's weird. But generally speaking, you're allowed to be angry.
So I was just going to say, comparatively, PTSD, would you say you see equal to or more than marital problems with PTSD? So are you dealing with PTSD and anger problems more or less than like the marital issues and divorce issues with soldiers?
Oh man. I mean, if I met somebody who was like, "Hey, I got married once and I've been married for 20 years and we're good," I would probably go play the lottery that day.
Fair.
I mean, the divorce rate is high, right? There's this sense of urgency, especially in young soldiers, to get married so that they get more money, so that they can live out of the barracks, because the barracks can sometimes be a dangerous place for people, right? Talking about MST.
Or they think they're going to die.
Right. So there's
I found the barracks actually very therapeutic. I'm just kidding.
Right. And because it also makes you feel a little bit like less autonomous, a little bit less human, right? You're just a bunch of like cattle in this barracks versus I'm a human, I'm a husband, I have my own home, I have my own space, right? So there's a little bit of a sense of urgency to do that.
And a lot of it's wanting privacy too. You don't want to bring a girl back to 100 dudes in a little barracks, and like I said, most of them are psychopaths and alcoholics, and it'd probably just be easier to marry some random broad and get a house.
Exactly.
That's what happens.
Then, you're doing this.
It happens often.
Yeah. Yeah. Usually they're strippers too, right? So like you're between the ages of 18 and 25. Your frontal cortex your prefrontal cortex.
So the first marriage.
You married a stripper who has daddy issues. Let's talk about what that marriage looks like then. What does a marriage look like? And then you're on deployment. Chances are somebody's cheating on somebody, or everybody's cheating on everybody, right? Then you get home.
Oh my goodness.
And your marriage falls apart. And then maybe you try it again.
So probably safe to say you deal with it more.
Things though. I mean, obviously there's different levels of intensity, right? And the PTSD can certainly make marital conflict far worse. Or, kind of like the example you used earlier, like if your spouse isn't open to hearing about your experiences with an open mind, or wants to be educated on what PTSD looks like, then that can also cause some issues. Right? Are you okay?
Let's clear the air though. Let's just draw it out. It's not all strippers. Some of it's bartenders, women from other countries.
Speaking from experience.
Women from other countries. There's a couple more categories there, but it's insane though that. I mean, come on. There's what is there? 1.2 million active duty. There's not 1.2 million strippers out there. Come on.
Oh no, there's a whole army.
It also depends on where you are, right? Like in the Fayetteville area, they don't call it Vietnam for no reason. There's places that you can find some people to marry, for sure.
So what would you say is the hardest part of being a therapist? Would it be dealing with PTSD patients, or hearing the stories?
For me,
Yeah,
I
for
think
you.
honestly the hardest part is that since I am personally not a veteran, it can be really hard to like kind of convince people that it's okay to come see me, right? When I was being contracted to work on Fort Bragg with active duty people, you had no choice, right? You had to deal with the civilian, chances are, because our active duty mental health people were usually deployed somewhere. Um, in the general community, it's a little bit, I think, more difficult to just be like, hey, I know I'm like this random person, but I am well educated on the culture because I have family members, friends, certificates, courses, experience doing the therapy with people. Um, I think also a lot of times comes a little bit of resistance to sharing the story, or thinking that like, oh, if I go to therapy, I have to tell the story
Yeah.
over again. That's not true. There are various types of therapeutic approaches that you don't have to tell the story. You just deal with the aftermath of it. We kind of like work backwards from the symptoms.
Let's talk about some positive stuff. Let's shift a little bit. We've been talking about kind of like the negative stuff,
Absolutely.
but let's talk about
Yeah.
this. Let's talk about the success though. What do you think is some of the biggest things that you can see, like whether you telling them to start doing this, start doing A, start doing B, and this is gonna start improving your life. What are you seeing that's a lot of very successful in veterans, helping them improve?
That's a great question. I feel like there's like a Rolodex now of people in my brain that are like, yeah, that worked. Um,
Well, that's a good thing.
Like, is there a
I mean, it
common
really is.
denominator? Is it like, hey, can we draw a circle around something? Like, I need you to start, you know, grow up. Yeah, I
She
need
just
you to
says,
start
"Quit being
growing
a
up.
baby."
Right.
I need you to be 25 before you can come to me. All right.
Man, I feel like that's like kind of a hard question
So it's
because
subjective to each person. Is what is it? That's what I'm
it
getting.
really
Okay.
is. It really is. Because you would think like, oh, like maybe by the time they come to see you, they're ready to do some work, and that's not always true. Um,
I
Sometimes
would
they
say
just
just
perception of like, hey, I'm going to go to a therapist. They're going to tell me what to do and how to fix my life, and it's going to be like magical. But they're not at a point yet where they can go and do the work that they need to. Right? It's kind of
I
like bringing
get.
your dog to a trainer an hour a week and then just like letting them do whatever they want in your house after that. Like, well, the dog's not going to be trained. It's
Yeah.
not going to be making any.
You could go to therapy for years and not do anything if you don't do what they're asking. Yeah, I get that too. Because like for me, I'll just say like I dealt with depression issues, and I think the some of the things that helped improve my life that my therapist had me do is she's like, she told me, she's like, one, find your passion again and something that you really like that's not drinking. And
Yeah.
she's like, she told me to get a dog. She's like, having that responsibility of taking care of something really changes your life because you start thinking about more than just yourself. And I think
Yeah.
that probably applies to veterans that are parents. But for me, I had a dog and I had to start taking care of this dog. And I started not dwelling in my issues as much because I was like, I got to walk my dog. It's my responsibility. She needs exercise. And I have to, oh, I got to feed my dog. I started thinking about taking care of something else than myself. And in a way, I took care of myself by taking care of something else. And then, and then I don't know, I started listening to therapy. I think that was the best thing is I started listening to what I was being instructed to do. And it helped me immensely. But I found things to divert my negative energy per se. And it was like, all right, I started working out. I started taking care of my dog instead of taking all my negative and putting it into a bad avenue, aka, all right, I had a bad week, I'm gonna go drink, that kind of thing. That was kind of what helped for me. Do you think?
Yeah.
I just want to say too, like, there's some people that say no drinking whatsoever, right? But do you think a veteran can live a happy life and just moderately drink and be just fine and have a happy marriage? Or do you think this drink or just drinking is just a really bad driver behind it?
Well, so to go back to your other question, I definitely think that doing things like physical activity, getting outside, getting sunshine, that stuff we all overlook a lot, and that can have a great positive snowball effect into being able to be at a point where you can then actively engage in therapy. So again, when you armadillo and you're always in your house and you're gaming all the time or scrolling around on your phone and it's like dark and you don't turn on the lights, that just kind of like flushes you down the toilet essentially, rather than kind of brings you back up. So yeah, getting a dog for that motivation is awesome. Doing some grounding work. I personally am not a fan of like meditating. I don't like to sit still. So I'll have people like, hey, if you're like a person who moves and that's how you process things, swimming is it for me because I can't hear anything but the bubbles and my whole body's moving and my entire brain and body is engaged and in sync at the same time. Find something like that that works. Art, whatever, express it, get it out somehow. Um, but then to go, I guess, back to the last thing that you asked about alcohol, just like anybody else, right? You can absolutely drink alcohol within reason and have a good relationship with alcohol. Um, depending on what your rationale is for drinking, right? We have a commonly accepted in society, oh, I had a hard day, I'm going to go drink, I'm going to go get drunk. So now you're using it instead of just coping and dealing with your hard day and your emotions, you're masking it with the alcohol, which, as we all know, once you wake up the next morning, you now have a hangover and you feel like crap and your problems are still there. And they're probably exactly, you also not like it that you're
Ouch.
drinking
Ouch.
I,
every.
Ouch. This is all stabbing me.
I think setting boundaries is a good thing too. I mean, like for me, I quit drinking 8 years ago now. Well, let me rephrase
Really?
that. I quit getting drunk 8 years ago, and what I did was I set boundaries. I only drink on Fridays or Saturdays. I only drink 2 beers or 3 beers, and I stop. Uh, if I start catching too much of a buzz, I'll go drink like 3 or 4 bottles of water, eat some food, and quit for the night. Uh, I started setting a lot of boundaries like that. Like my big one, aside from that, was push-ups. So if I want to snack or pee or take a shower, I have to earn it. I do 20 push-ups every time I want to do anything. And
Wait, to
setting
pee?
boundaries like that help anything.
Like I
Anything
have
in the house.
I go to the bathroom so bad, but I got to do 20
Yeah.
push-ups. Hey, I'm not hating that. That's
Dude,
effective.
the more water I drink, the more hydrated I am, the more I piss, the stronger I get.
That's definitely like next level self discipline. I don't know. Do that.
But that's what I'm saying. I think it's person
Yeah.
dependent. Like, I'm not saying be a functioning alcoholic and have an amazing marriage, but you have to set boundaries for yourself of
it,
some sort.
I think it breaks down to kind of what you said earlier. It's subjective. Each person finds their own coping mechanism. That's a positive coping mechanism, not a negative one. Um, and I think now that I'm thinking about it, what are some of the let's is there some of the positive coping mechanisms that you can think that have helped veterans? Like we've listed a couple, right? Working out, getting sunshine, going outdoors. Are there any other ones that are really impactful that you see?
Yeah. Man, so many. I think honestly, so my thing lately has been the grounding techniques that we kind of start teaching people before we do EMDR. And the grounding techniques are really universal and can do it's like a lot of like mental imagery. Um,
Wait, can I
and
interrupt
so
you
you
real
can,
quick for the
yeah.
benefit of the audience, aka me? Could
Oh
you
Yeah,
yes.
me
tell
as
me
well.
tell me what the acronym means? I mean, I love
So
acronyms, but I don't
Yep.
know what it is.
yes, it's eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. Don't ask me to say it fast or again. It's tough.
I
Um, so
already.
in a nutshell, basically, it is. Oh, how do I nutshell this? It uses bilateral stimulation. So at first, it was just eye movements, left to right across a screen, or whatever, following some fingers. And there's a whole protocol to it, so please don't just like start like telling yourself different things and whatever. Then we found out that you can actually just do it kind of with anything. So a lot of times people have like little buzzies you can hold and it buzzes alternating, or we can like tap on you back before COVID when we would actually get like, up close and personal. And so what that does is kind of it helps both hemispheres of our brain start talking to each other again. Because when we have a traumatic experience, it gets stored in our short-term memory, and then it starts kind of like spidey webbing itself to anything that kind of feels or felt maybe similar. So then all of those things just kind of sit in our short-term memory. And when we go to sleep, when our brains are supposed to be washed out and that short-term memory is supposed to be washed out and then filed back in our long-term memory, it kind of stays there, which is where the hypervigilance stuff comes from, right? Door slams, you like poop yourself and like jump 10 feet in the air like a scared cat. It's because short-term memory is saying, oh my God, it's happening again, right? It just happened 5 minutes ago. It's happening again. So with the EMDR, waking up both sides, because short-term memory lives up here, long-term memory lives in the back left. It helps those memories cross that bridge and get filed appropriately. So in the beginning, before you start doing this stuff, you really have to be able to compartmentalize to a degree. So there's something called a container exercise where, hey, if I'm going through my day and I'm starting to feel real anxious about something, I can kind of identify that. I can put it into the container in my brain and it can stay there because I can't be interrupted right now with a panic attack. But later on, I'm going to open up that box and I'm going to take a look at it and be like, what was going on here? Something else that can be really helpful is the imagery of this like safe or calm place where you, in as much detail as possible, describe it to yourself. And because putting words to the image makes the image stronger. And then being able to say like, okay, I'm going to think about something that's a little bit upsetting. And I'm going to start feeling that upsetness, or I'm going to start feeling that anxiety kind of come up. And then I'm going to walk away from that. I'm going to go into my calm place and feel everything calm down. And those things are not things that you have to sit down and be like for like 5 minutes with your eyes closed, right? Once you start get used to it and practice it, it can happen pretty easily and quickly. Shifting breathing techniques, we talk about like the box technique where you imagine yourself drawing a box, right? So you do like maybe 4 breath counts in, 4 across, 4 down, 4 over. So in, out, in, out. And again, it kind of serves the same purpose that I was talking about earlier about swimming, where your brain and your body is all engaged in the same task at the same time. You're imagining the drawing, the breaths, your body's doing the breathing. So things like that can be really helpful, and it's something you can do on the go.
Nice. So I can't even say it.
Compartmentalization.
Thank you. That thing. So if I have a problem, I can file it away and then deal with it later in the day when I have the right tools in front of me, or the when I'm ready to deal with it. Is essentially what you're saying. That's pretty cool.
Yeah. The key, though, is making sure that you go back in that box and take it out. I know men have the nothing box, right?
Yeah.
It's not the nothing box where it just goes and somewhere.
There's a file cabinet and it just gets buried.
Right.
Exactly.
And that's what soldiers are really good at, too, is compartmentalization, because you have to have a civilian you and a deployed you, and they have 2 completely different personalities and usually memories, and you just split them in 2, keep them apart so that you're not being a savage with your civilian friends, and vice versa. You don't want to be a civilian when you're in a warlike scenario.
Yeah. I think that's a little bit of where the difficulty comes in sometimes with some active duty or some veterans, is that they're like, oh yeah, I can put things in boxes. It's like, oh yeah, well, guess you have to take it out to have to look at it later.
What's the best way to look at it later, though? Like, take it out.
When you're alone and drunk.
I mean, honestly, you could do it alone. You could do it in conversation, right? If we're talking about connection with people, like, hey, I was at work today and I started feeling like a little bit anxious, and I don't really know what that was about. I'm gonna take a look at that. What was I thinking at the time? What was my body doing? Like, what was I feeling? Was I reading something or hearing something from somebody else? Maybe overhearing a conversation that kind of sparked something, right? And I hate using the word trigger. It's become such like a buzzword that like I just want to
Yeah.
like just know. Um, but what happened that like sparked a memory? And sometimes there's like this whole big chain of things that are connected, right? That's why it's like, oh, 4th of July happens and you hear the fireworks and there's barbecuing. And then now maybe in September, it's Labor Day, no more fireworks, but there's barbecuing and you're smelling that hot dog that your brain remembers was connected to the fireworks, which sounds like the gunshots, which reminds you of your combat experience or reminds you that, oh man, I ended up not going um, out with these guys at that time to do this thing, and I was back here, and somebody took my spot, and that person died. And
Oh,
so then you're like, well, why am I on Labor Day upset about a hot dog? That's why, because there's this whole stimulus chain that happens, and that can be really difficult. And that's part of the reason why early intervention is really important, because then it's really hard to figure out why why a hot dog, right?
yeah. So early intervention, talking about your problems early, just getting it out and having connection with people is sounds like some big things. Um,
Yes.
we want to thank you for coming on. It's and taking the time out of your day to come on, and as we grow, you're definitely a guest we'd want to have back on. Is there
Yeah,
anything that
for sure.
you want to plug for our audience? Do you have a book or do you have any type of thing you want to plug while you're here?
I appreciate that. Not yet. I am
Okay.
working on a book. One day it'll be finished. Um, but I do kind of like loosely do like consultations for people. Obviously I can't do therapy for people who aren't like in states that I'm licensed in, but happy to do consultations for like organizations or whatever that are like, hey, how can we best support and be proactive for our either first responder population or, veteran students or veteran staff or whatever. So
I
that's
would
fun.
like to chime in too. Earlier, Gillum asked if there was anything that helped veterans that you could think of. And we didn't really pick one, but you said you had a whole Rolodex. And that to me says that therapy helps. That means you had a lot of people with success stories, no matter what it was. So I would recommend reaching out to a therapist. I mean, if nothing else, that clearly works. I mean, you have a whole Rolodex of memories of people getting better and being happier. So no matter what they did, I mean, you were involved in it.
Absolutely. And I think one of the other important things too for people to remember is that, I guess, contrary to popular practice, you don't typically marry the first person you date, right? Or the first stripper you see. So the same goes for therapists. You're not always going to connect on that like emotionally intimate level that you need to with a therapist the first time that you get it, the first time that you go to therapy, right? So maybe by like the third, fourth session, if you're really not feeling like, yeah, I can open up to this person, find another one.
Yeah.
There's the Star Registry, I think. It's through the I want to say through the University of Texas. Um, I can get you more details about that, but there's
Okay.
like a bunch of providers that have to go through specific military like culture, military specific topics, trainings in order to get on this registry to be able to serve military and veterans.
And would you
So
just tell that therapist, like, hey, this isn't working out. I don't think I can open up to you, or should you just ghost them? Just call someone else.
I mean, it's usually nice to like not ghost people, right? But you can literally just say like, "Hey, I think just I'm not feeling this." I personally don't get offended by things like that. Somebody else might, I don't know, but like I'm not going to force somebody who doesn't feel like they can talk to me to stay and talk to me, right? My goal is in the best interest of this client, and if this client's like, "Hey, do you have any referrals to somebody who's maybe a little bit more well versed in military culture? I'd be like, absolutely. Like, no problem. Like, what specifically are you looking for? What do you need? I will help you find it.
You know what offends me? No, never mind. I'm not going to say it.
You know what gets under my skin?
Yeah. So summing up, talk about your problems. You should probably get therapy. It's going to help out. It's going to make your life better. It's probably going to make your marriage better. Don't marry a stripper. Those are just some of the basics that you should just do.
Yes.
You can't change her.
No. I mean, maybe, right? Like,
well, you heard the therapist. Go try.
Maybe with therapy. No.
Right. You can change a stripper.
Together.
Everybody therapy.
Everyone does.
Everybody should. I feel like that should be like a general requirement. Like once you hit a certain age in this world, you just go to therapy. Just make it normal.
Or when you come back
for a little bit.
When you come back from deployment, they should just put every veteran in therapy. It doesn't. You have to go to at least 10 sessions. They should just do that, and then go from there. Because go back to the questionnaire. The questionnaire is not cutting it. We got to do stuff better for the veterans out there, and that's got to be a requirement. We have to take care of them better. And guys, we just said it. We don't always want to admit we have a problem, or we want to, ask for help. So if you're forced to go get help, it might not be people don't like being forced, but it might able to get you to start talking about those issues and get your step in the right direction. I think that's just me.
And then if everybody's doing it, it's less like I have to, leave the office right now because I have to go to therapy, or I have to like sneak on lunch because I have to go to therapy. It's just like, hey, yo, what time is your session? All right, cool. Like I'll cover for you. Like awesome. And I think also having more proactive policies in like, maybe at the 6-month mark and at the 1-year mark, you check back in with people. Maybe not a whole nother 10 more sessions, but maybe like if you can't do 10 sessions to begin with, the check in when you get home, check in at 6 months, check in at a year, couple of sessions, and then decide from there, like, okay, do I need more? We like epically fail everybody by like leaving it up to them to just like, oh, like when you feel like going, you can go. Because there's a whole lot of stuff.
10 years later.
Yeah.
Right.
No, I should probably go. It's my second divorce.
Well, like Gillum said, thank you a lot for coming on.
Thank you for having me, guys.
We would love to have you back on. And thank you, everybody else, for listening. I hope you all enjoyed the episode. And if you did, make sure you subscribe, reach out. If you have any questions for us or her, just drop them in the comments or send us an email.
Yep, it's time to pop smoke. The Shieldwall podcast. We out.
Y'all have a good weekend.
Bye, guys.